Good morning again, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on workers' compensation, where we're going to talk about tips and tricks and strategies to really take control of your workers' compensation program and really get it in control and control the cost. And there's several strategic things that we're going to talk about today. But thanks for joining. These sessions are meant to be 60 minutes of just action-packed information so that you can take that information and make it applicable to your operations and continuing improving your operations from a risk management and insurance perspective. A couple of housekeeping things to begin with. On your screen, you will see a Q&A section. Please ask your questions throughout the webinar. Don't feel like you have to hold them to the end, but ask questions in real time as they come up during the webinar. It always makes for more interesting conversation whenever questions pop up throughout the webinar rather than waiting to the end. You can also utilize the chat function to make comments or even throwing out practical advice that maybe your operation or your organization does to talk about some of the things that were tips or strategies. For example, if you implemented this certain document within your organization, feel free to share that experience within the comments or the chat section that you can utilize within the platform. So to get started, guys, first off, my name is Cameron Annis. I'm the CEO. I have the fortunate pleasure to serve as the CEO of Granite Insurance, and then also am our national practice leader for our adventure and entertainment division. And really look forward to spending the next 60 minutes with you guys. My information and contact information is there on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me at any point in time that I can be of assistance to you in your risk management and insurance program.
And I am Chris Murray. I'm a senior business risk consultant. I've been with Granite for a little over 7 years and the program director of our Arrival Pro Shield program. And look forward to chatting with you guys today and hopefully giving you something to take away from it.
Awesome. Chris, out of curiosity, what is Arrival Pro Shield, that program?
Sure. That's a program that we developed, sort of a partnership with a group called Arrival. And if you're not familiar with Arrival is they don't call themselves an association, but they're a group of members that are there in the tours, attractions, and experiences industry. And they are there to be a pool for resources for operators in that industry, talking about best practices, offering resources to help them get some sort of bulk buying power and economies of scale, if you will. So let's jump into it. What are we going to talk about today? The first thing is we're going to talk about what is my experience mod factor and how do I control it? How can I control the cost of my workers' compensation? A lot of people think you just get what you get, but this is actually the most controllable part of your insurance program. And how can I implement an effective return to work program? What does that look like?
Awesome. So the first kind of starting about the quick basics and kind of what we'll do here, guys, in today's session, we're going to talk about a little bit about the basics of workers' compensation. Some of this may be stuff you know, but it is important that we establish the foundation, and then we'll talk about the strategies that build off of the foundation. But talking about the quick basics, a little piece of trivia knowledge for you guys. So workers' compensation was set up back in the 1930s. And the reason it was set up is because employees were suing their employers for any time they were injured in the scope of work in their employment. And what it did was it backlogged the court systems, that the courts just became so overwhelmed with all of the cases of these suits that it clogged up the court system. So what states began doing was they said, we need what we call an exclusive remedy or a sole remedy doctrine. And they developed workers' compensation that says, instead of suing your employer, this is a benefit that employers must provide to their employees. So that's the reason workers' compensation was created, was to really unclog the court system. A little bit of trivia knowledge for you guys there. Workers' compensation, the second bullet point here, we'll talk about what it's based off of, and we think of what it's based off of. How do you measure the degree of risk? And so there's two factors whenever you measure the degree of risk. Is number one, how much payroll do you have? If you have $1 million in payroll, you probably have less risk than someone who has $10 million of payroll. And so that quantifies your one part of your risk factor. So obviously, the more payroll you have, the more workers' compensation premium you're going to pay, because theoretically your risk of having a employee injury is higher at 10 million in payroll than 1 million in payroll. The second side of that equation is rate, or essentially your class code. And this is where, for example, if you're in the amusement world, you may pay 2% to 20% is your rate of payroll. And that's, per 2 to 20% of payroll. Whereas if you're an office worker or you're clerical, you may only pay 0.05% or to 1% of payroll. And you may say, like, why is the swing from 2 to 20%? Why is it such a large swing there? And that swing depends on the state that you're doing business in. For example, the clerical rate in North Carolina, I believe, is like 0.15 or 0.2%, whereas the clerical rate in California is 1%. And so rates vary by state depending upon the cost of medical attention in that state, and also the litigiousness of workers' compensation injuries in that state. So that's kind of what varies the rate there. And the other quick basic to know is the last bullet point here is that your workers' compensation premium, whenever you bind coverage, is just really an estimate. And what that means is that's how much estimated payroll you think you're going to have during the next year. After the end of the policy year, what will happen is an audit. And typically people think like audit and that's a bad thing. But in this sense, an audit is not a bad thing. Really, all it is squaring up on what you said your estimated payroll was going to be. If you had more payroll than you estimated, you're going to owe some money. And if you had less payroll than you estimated, you're going to get some money back. So it's really just a squaring up of the payrolls that you estimated. But it is important to make sure your payroll estimates are somewhat accurate, and that if you know halfway through the policy year that you guys just grew like crazy and you had a lot more payroll, go ahead and tell your agent about that or your advisor, because what can happen is you can build in that additional premium through the rest of your payments rather than getting hit with a surprise $50,000 audit bill at the end of your policy, which may not be the best cash flow time for your organization, especially if you're not preparing for it. So to kind of talk about a visual of what we just talked about in the previous slide there is just how your workers' compensation payroll is calculated. And this is just putting a visual in what we just talked about. Is number one, you start with your payroll estimate, you divide it by 100, and then you get the rate for that specific operation that you are. In this example, we use the 9180 class code, which is the amusement class code. And whenever you multiply those things together, you get the end equation there, or the end solution, which is your manual premium. But that's not where it stops. And the next part is really what we're going to talk a lot about today, and what is controllable. So the next part is you take your manual premium and you multiply it by this really fancy word called your experience mod factor. And that's where a lot of our conversation is going to be focused on today. And the combination or multiplication of those two things gives you your net premium, which is your final premium that you actually pay. And so below, this just kind of talks this through actual numbers. If we had $600,000 of payroll, we would divide that by 100. Let's say the state amusement rate for, trying to think, let's say North Carolina was $8 or 8% of payroll. We would get $48,000. But then again, we have to multiply that $48,000 by the experience mod to get your final premium of $61,000. So as you can see here, that experience mod has a huge impact on what you actually end up paying. And so that's what we're going to focus a lot on today, is how do we control that experience mod? Because you can. It is, let's call it 90% controllable if you're doing the right things. And that's what we're going to talk about today a lot.
That's good information, Cameron. And just like it's important to understand the basics of workers' compensation to have this conversation, it's also important to understand, at least at a high level, what the experience mod is. I won't bore you with the formula. It's very complicated formula, but essentially it is a scorecard. It is for every dollar of payroll in a particular code, you have a statistical expected number of losses. Okay, so um, a roofing code is going to have more expected losses than the clerical code. Um, and then so your experience mod is the difference. It is your actual losses compared with the statistical expected losses. And if you were to have exactly the same number of dollars of claims or losses as expected, your multiplier, your experience mod would be a 1.0. Or if you perform better, you have less actual losses than expected, you'll get a credit. And if you have more actual losses than expected, you'll get a debit. And you see there the multiplier there. You take that same scenario from the slide before. You got $48,000 in manual premium. If you had a 0.8 experience mod, that's a 20% credit. So your net premium or final premium calculation would be 38.4. Conversely, if you had a debit mod, still the same manual premium, 48,000, but you didn't perform so well. And so your experience mod is a 1.2. Now that's a 20% debit. So you would pay 57,600 in final premium. Um, that's pretty high level, especially the actual versus expected. So I'll pause here and make sure that it is important that we understand at least that much before we move on and start talking about it in a little more detail. If you got any questions, if any of that stuff doesn't make sense, either pop it in the Q&A or in the chat there, and we'll stop and address that.
That's good, Chris. I mean, that's a huge swing, for someone to be able to go from $38,000 to $57,000. I mean, that's almost a $20,000 swing by just this simple little experience mod factor.
Yeah, it's extremely important. Again, it's a direct multiplier of your premium. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing for you, it's either a credit or a debit, but it is a direct multiplier. And we'll talk about what we can do to control that here in just a second. Don't see any other comments, so I'll assume we're all on the same page. So let's talk a little bit more about experience mod. First of all, you have to qualify or meet certain qualifications to get an experience mod. And those are that your work comp premium has to be high enough. In North Carolina, it's $5,000. It's going to vary by state. But let's assume for this conversation it's $5,000. So you have to have spent at least $5,000 on workers' compensation premium. And you have to have done that for the last 3 years. 3 years of history is what is involved in the calculation of the experience mod. The second point here, we said that the average is a 1.0. So if you do what you're expected to do, you're going to have a 1.0. And if you do better, you're going to get a credit. And if you do worse, you get a debit. I got distracted there because I see a question here. Let me pop over here. How do you determine the correct category of risk for your particular operation and various jobs? Is that determined by the insurance provider? That's a great question, Ryan. The NCCI, National Council for Compensation Insurance, publishes every class code, and in the class code, they'll give a description of what is to go into that class code. It's very detailed, and for most industries or most employees, it's very clear. There are some where it's kind of ambiguous, and then they'll have a not otherwise classed, like an NOC on the end of it. So that may catch something that's not specifically addressed. But it's intended to be spelled out so that it takes any ambiguity out of the equation. If you're in one of those situations where, okay, it looks like I could fit here, or could fit there, then your agent should be talking to the underwriter with your carrier and getting clarification on what class code they prefer to have you in, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. That's a great question.
That's good. I was going to say two other things on that, Chris, is number one, is the biggest misperception that we see with class codes is people think that each individual employee is given a class code. And when The actual truth is a business is given a class code, and there is exceptions to the class code. So each individual employee is not given a class code. A great example of this is, let's take a amusement operation where you may have people working at height, and you also have people maybe working the check-in station. The way the workers' compensation statutes are written is the business is given one class code that contemplates both of those things happening. Whereas most people think like, oh, the at height person should only be in the amusement, and then the person working the desk should be in like a retail class code. That's not the way the workers' compensation class code system works. It's essentially a blended rate. They know that, hey, you're going to have people working on the counter and at height. So they have a blended rate, and it makes things easier. So you don't have 84 class codes for every single employee. You just have one class code for the business that takes into consideration everything that the business is doing.
Thanks for that, Cam. And I'll take this opportunity to elaborate even a little further. There are a couple of exceptions to that. One of those is the 8810 class code, or clerical. So regardless of what industry you're in, whatever your company's main class code is, if you have people that are strictly clerical, and I mean strictly, they're not doing anything but clerical work, you can break out their payroll and put it in the clerical class code. Same thing goes for outside salespeople. And then in the construction industry, if there's clear, distinct, different responsibilities of the employee, meaning you have an employee that does nothing but plumbing and you have an employee that does nothing but roofing, you can divide their payroll up into different class codes. But in general, like Cam said, you're going to have a governing class code for your business, and then potentially the 8810, but everything else is going to go into that governing code. So minimum and maximum, remember, the experience mod is a scorecard, and it is measuring the delta between actual losses and expected losses. The larger that delta, the more effect it has on the experience mod. So a minimum mod would be if a company had 0 losses, and comparing that to their expected losses, if that delta is bigger, so their expected losses were $50,000, but they had 0 losses, then they may have a 0.9. If another company had more payroll or higher risk class codes and their expected losses were 100, but they still actually had 0, then they may be a 0.8. So the higher the expected losses, if you have 0 losses, the higher your expected losses, the lower your minimum experience mod can be, potentially. With a max, there is no max. We've seen them all over the board. If you get up into the 1.5, 1.7, that's high, because that means you're paying 50 or 70% more than your manual premium. But we've seen it as high as in the high 3s. Any questions on that? Is that making sense? Great. So how do we control our work comp costs? I told you that workers' compensation is the most controllable piece of your insurance program. You could not have any employees. You could not pay your employees, or you could not have accidents. Those would all lower your costs, but they aren't realistic. Realistically speaking, and this is where the strategy comes in, is when you have an accident, when an employee gets injured on the job, it's how you handle it. And that's going to dictate how you control your workers' compensation costs. That's high level. We'll get into the weeds on that in just a minute, but that's where the magic happens, is handling the claim after the accident.
Thanks for that, Chris. So what does handling an accident the right way look like? And really, you guys have probably heard the terminology return to work program. This is where a lot of this kind of boils back to, and we'll go through the logistics of it. And then at the, probably in 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to get to the actual math side of things and showing you guys different scenarios of without a return to work program, how this would play out, and then with a return to work program, how this would play out. But a return to work program being in place, or some people may call it a light duty program or a light duty return to work program, it's critical to have this in place before an accident happens. And we'll explain exactly why of that. But what does that look like? Is number one, what this looks like is first, the employee gets, when they're injured, they get a form to take to the doctor that has specific questions outlined that you need to know for this return to work program to be answered. For example, how much can they lift? How long are they on restricted duty? What can they do? Can they return to work? All of those types of things to where you need those answers. What we see a lot of times is whenever employees go to the doctor without one of these, they don't get those answers or the answers to those questions. And also, who knows what that employee is telling the doctor? For example, if they're a tree trimmer, they may be telling the doctor, like, oh, yeah, I'm a tree trimmer, and that's the only thing that my company has openings for. They don't tell them that, hey, I could sit in the office and count paper clips or remove staples from packets or whatever that may be, because that's not what they want to do. If you click on the QR code, or not click on it, but scan the QR code, guys, at the bottom of the page, it will take you to a example or even one you could use of that doctor form that they can take with them to the doctor. So this form lives on our website. It's always there. Use it as a resource, but again, scan that QR code to be able to go to that. The key here is whenever they get that doctor note back, you have to get them back to work within 3 to 7 days. And this 3 to 7 day window depends on which state that you're in. So we'll provide a chart here on the next slide that shows you, actually, I'll just flip to it now and then flip back. So this is the deviation of states, whether you have to have them back to work within 3 days in order to kind of get this huge discount, which we're going to talk about in a minute, 4 days, 5 days, or 7 days. We like 7 days, obviously, because it allows you more time to get that person back up and working in some type of light duty capacity. 3 days sometimes can be difficult. And guys, keep in mind, these are 3 calendar days. This is not 3 days that they were scheduled. So if they're a part-time employee and they were scheduled on Monday, the next Monday, and then the next Monday, that's not 3 weeks. No, it's 3 calendar days that they have to be back and in some type of light duty capacity. So take a note of where your state is and then the applicable number of days that they must be back in a return to work capacity in order to implement or use this strategy. On the third bullet point there is, you need to know what these people can do. What do you have available to them to be able to do from a light duty position? Is that, answering phones or making reservations, just anything busy work, whatever it is, twiddling their thumbs, watching Netflix, whatever that is. You're going to see in a minute, like how financially important it is to saving workers' compensation premium to get them doing something.
And before you go to the next slide there, I'll elaborate there a little bit. You may be thinking, well, I don't need them to answer phones or make reservations, doing busy work. That I can't afford to just pay them to not produce or to be doing their job. When we go through some calculations in a minute, you'll realize that even paying them to work, that expense to you is going to benefit you in the long run versus letting the carrier pay them to sit at home or pay disability while they're injured.
Great point. Thanks, Murray. And again, you may be thinking, like, why are we wanting to do this? And this is what we're going to talk about next, is what this system helps us prevent that essentially dings you on your experience mod, that makes your workers' compensation become a lot more expensive.
All right. So now we're going to start to get into the weeds a little bit, but it's important to understand the basis. Workers' compensation claims are labeled as 2 types. They're either indemnity, which means that there are some lost time wages and disability payments, whether that's temporary or permanent, but in what we're talking about here is temporary. So go back to the scenario where the employee of the tree trimmer goes to the doctor. He's busted his knee up and he can't climb trees, obviously. And a lot of times the doc will say, all right, we'll sit at home for 2 weeks and come back and see me. And because they didn't take that form, because the employer hadn't communicated the importance of the return to work, they do that. Well, then they're going to miss this strategy, right? Because it was now they've been out for longer than the grace period in the chart before. So anytime there's paid lost time wages, that claim is classified as indemnity. If there's no lost time wages, it stays as medical only. So it means all they paid out was medical bills. They may have even paid for an ambulance ride for the guy to go to the ER to get his knee looked at. They pay for the x-rays, the MRIs, whatever's needed to be done, but they take care of medical bills. And if there's no lost time wages, it's medical only. The reason that's important is medical only claims get a 70% discount when they hit that formula for the experience mod. So we'll get into some actual numbers here, but let me reiterate that. So in that scenario, the busted knee, he goes to the hospital. There are $10,000 worth of medical bills, but we get him light duty. We get him back to work. There's no lost time wages that are paid. It's medical only. So only $3,000 of that hits your calculation and your actual losses.
That's
Pause
great.
there. Anything not making sense there?
A lot of people are thinking and adding things to the chat and Q&A.
I'm not seeing that for some reason, Cam.
I was going to say, I lost my train of thought of what I was going to say there. Or what I was going to say is the biggest thing that we see is, and a lot of people ask questions on, what does it matter how much indemnity is paid? And no, it doesn't. Like once $1 of indemnity or lost time wages is paid, you lose that full 70% discount. And so what we see a lot of times is people that go 1 day past the grace period. And we look at that when we're evaluating a potential client, and we're like, man, like this just cost you thousands of dollars because the insurance company paid out $68 for a one shift that this person missed past the grace period. So, I mean, this is huge, guys. I'll go ahead and go to some of the calculations for you. Or go ahead, Murray.
All right, perfect. So this scenario here, these are all indemnity claims, okay? By the way, for this table and the next table, this particular company, their manual premium is $48,000, just like the calculations before. So let's see how these claims impact their premium. The first claim you see there, $22,265, is going to affect the mod by adding 2.882 to the experience mod. So if that was the only claim they had, they were at a 1.0. Now it's going to be a 1.2882. The effect on the premium over the next 3 years is going to be $41,501. And I'll do the math on that just to kind of show you. So they were at $48,000 times 1.2882, because that's their new experience mod. That is now $61,833 a year, which is $13,833 more than their manual premium. Okay, they were at 48, now they're at 61, so that's $13,000 increase. That's going to stay with them for 3 years. So it's going to have an impact of $41,500. I won't do the math on each of the following, but you see the $7,900 claim, 0.1344. It's going to cost them additional $19,000 over 3 years. And then 1527 is going to cost them 3730. Neil, one of the past owners, the CEO of the company, used to use the analogy, or used to say, that workers' compensation is a very expensive financing mechanism. And you see there why. $22,000 claim costs you $41,000 over 3 years. $15,000 claim costs you more than double that, $3730 over 3 years. So what do we do? How can we control that? And this is where the magic happens. I kind of nerd out on this next part because it's so impactful. So let's take the exact same scenario. You see the table on top shows exactly what we just looked at. So those three claims were costing a total of $64,000 over 3 years, an additional premium because of the experience mod. But look, let's say we kept those claims. We were able to keep all of those claims to medical only. Same number of dollars in the left-hand column, 31,726, but they all got a 70% discount when they hit the experience mod calculation. So only $9,500 shows as actual expenses on the calculation. That is a total of a 0.13 increase in their mod, and their total increase in premium over 3 years as a result of that is $19,354. Same claims, but we got them back to work within the grace period and kept it to medical only. That's a total savings of $45,231 over 3 years. That's pretty impactful, and it's not that difficult to employ. I don't know. I get excited here. And we've seen certain accounts, real life scenarios where just this is played out, and it just blows people's minds that this simple strategy can have such an impact.
That's exactly what I mean. So, I mean, Chris, I mean, the key, and guys, feel free to throw any questions in the Q&A if you have any. I mean, the key is whenever someone is injured, as long as it's not a disability issue, like you have the option of whether it's an indemnity claim or a medical claim. And it all boils down to whether you have that return to work program in place or that light duty program. We can essentially force a claim to be coded as medical only by implementing your return to work program. So kind of circling around, like in talking about action items, like, hey, if you're sitting here today and thinking about, man, this is really cool, I would love to implement this. What are the next steps? What are the action items? So number one, if you click on that QR code or scan that QR code guide, that pulls up a 6-step process. And that's just something that you can keep at your office. Your general manager can have sitting at their desk, whatever it is. It's 6 steps of, this is a lot of information. I just need it boiled down into 6 steps. This gives you 6 steps of whenever an employee is injured, what do I do? Step 1, get the medical attention. You know, it goes through those 6 steps. And I think step 4 or 5 or maybe 3 is implement them in the return to work program. But this is just really good to go over in your staff meeting or something of that nature. But kind of full circle, you know, what are the steps? Is number 1, the importance is always getting the employee back to work. Not only do we see, like, financially, guys, that this saves them money, but a couple of other really cool things happen. Is number 1 is they're going to get better quicker because they're back and around people. You know, their mental state is better because they're around people. They're not sitting at home. Second is litigation typically is a lot less because they're not sitting at home during lunchtime. If you ever notice, at lunchtime is whenever the 1-800 injured on the job commercials come on because people are sitting at home that are injured on the job. So it prevents them from seeing those commercials and kind of thinking, ooh, should I sue my employer? And then the third thing is people get better quicker whenever they are around people and probably whenever they're in a job they don't enjoy. So for example, if somebody's used to being a zipline guide or a rafting operator or being a school teacher, if they're in a clerical role where they're just sitting there pulling staples out of packets, they're going to want to get back very quickly to the job that they were hired for and intended for because that's what they enjoy. Bullet 2 there is, you know, obviously keeping them as medical only. That's the magic sauce to all of this, is keeping it as medical only and getting that 70% discount on your experience mod, which is what multiplies your manual premium. Another kind of full circle of action items. If you don't have a return to work program in place, get that in place. And kind of 3 components of that is number 1, that doctor's form or that we had a QR code for earlier in the presentation. Number 2 is to have an idea of potential job duties that people could do that are light duty. And then number 3, which I think is key, is setting expectations with your employees. A lot of times employers think workers' compensation is this thing that we don't want to talk about because we don't want people filing workers' compensation claims. When in reality, what that probably promotes or what that advocates is whenever someone's injured on the job, they may not tell you about it 5, 6 days later, maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, which means that's typically what happens is that injury gets worse over that time period. And then you're in a position where you can't avoid a disability claim, or, they're going to be out for 6 months. But really create the culture of workers' compensation is here to take care of our employees. It is a benefit. Go over with them that, and of that benefit, you're not going to get fired if you file a workers' compensation claim. In fact, we're probably just going to put you in another position and keep you here at the company in a light duty capacity. The other unexpected thing that comes out of that message is, number one, it is just, hey, we're here as an employer that cares and wants to take care of you. But also what comes out of that is you don't get the fraudulent workers' compensation claims that people may think if they can get out of work, they'll just sit at home and collect a paycheck. That's no longer applicable because they know that they're going to have to come back to work and do something that they don't enjoy doing in an office capacity or something like that. So setting that expectation of what is a return to work program, you could easily even put, and send us an email on this if you'd like. We have language that you can put in your employee handbook about just, hey, we embrace a return to work program. If you're injured, we'll put you in a light duty capacity, things of that nature. Chris, anything that you would add to those full circle action items?
Just a thought that I had as you were talking about, work comp being kind of taboo and not knowing. I find a lot of times, and I'll do a presentation for some of my clients occasionally, just educating the employees on what workers' compensation is. They're seeing these commercials and billboards, your employer doesn't care about you, let us get what you deserve, etc. They may not realize that they have other options. They may think, if I get hurt at work and I can't do my job, I'm going to be financially in trouble, because that's all they're hearing. So me going in and just educating the employees that this is a system, like Cameron said in the beginning, this is a system that is set up as a benefit, a required statutory benefit for you as an employee, so that we can take care of your medical bills. We can get you back to work. We're going to, even if you can't do your normal job, we care about you enough that we're going to create a position for you to accommodate your restrictions. And having that conversation before an employee gets injured a lot of times eliminates the, oh no, now what do I have to do to take care of my family? Let me get the attorney on the phone. So it's extremely important that everybody's education, that is an open discussion, and employees do come to you when they're injured. Can you?
Great point.
I got a question here. Can the QR code form? You got it.
Yeah, I see there are a couple questions rolling in. Feel free to keep adding those in there, guys. Somebody asked for the QR code for the doctor form again. Here is that QR code for the doctor form for anybody that would like to scan that again.
Go ahead and take that. That can also be found along with some other resources, by the way, on our website at grandinsurance.com. Several pieces on there that you may find helpful in addition to this.
Mm-hmm. On the top right-hand section, there's a tab that's titled Resources. Feel free to, on the website, feel free to explore any of those resources for you guys. Sample incident reports, sample witness statements, this doctor's form, a lot of different stuff.
The other QR code, Cameron, you want to pull that up? That one has the template for incident reporting and how to handle a claim, or I'm sorry, how to handle an injury after something happens.
There's that.
And while we've got a few minutes here, I'm curious. I don't think we've got a poll set up, but and maybe we don't have to know the answer to it, but I'll ask you all. How many of you know what your experience mod is? What's your current experience mod rating? And maybe even more important, do you know what it's going to be if you've got a renewal in 3 months? Do you know what it's going to be on that renewal? We have software that we can put in your claims data and predict and tell you what it's going to be, so that if you do have one that's getting ready to hit and you're going to go from a 0.8 to a 1.5, you can be prepared for that 70% increase on your premium. it's something that you you may not have to know it to the decimal, but you should know what your experience mod is.
Yeah, and keep a history of that, guys. Set goals to develop a plan to have a goal as a company. Like, hey, we want to be at a 0.8 experience mod, and whenever you get there, reward yourself. You see the talking about experience mods. You see at manufacturing companies, construction companies. You see all these signs and celebrations of 1 million hours worked without a lost time injury. And you're like, oh yeah, it's a huge safety thing. The reason they do that is because this experience mod. That is the reason people have campaigns from an employee incentive. I mean, you can see the financial effects of having a low experience mod. It's tens of thousands of dollars. And for large companies, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's why they have it a part of their culture, guys.
And that is, while this is something that's very controllable after a claim happens, it's almost, probably shouldn't have to say this, but let me say it, that doesn't mean you should ignore all of your safety tactics and just say, oh, well, we're just going to hit you with medical only, so we don't care if somebody gets hurt. This is obviously just a part of the management. It's still extremely important to be safe and try to eliminate those claims altogether.
With that, guys, thanks for attending. Hope this was beneficial and helpful to your operation. We're always here to help and empower you to be successful. If there's anything we can help with in helping you even set up a return to work program, please feel free to reach out to myself or Chris or any team member here at Granite Insurance that you work with. We're always happy to help. Thanks, guys.